There wasn't any screaming. No chaos, just a regular Thursday morning training exercise that was about to go sideways in about 12 seconds flat, and Captain Sarah Chun, the woman they'd been calling just a nurse for the past 4 months, was the only thing standing between 17 Special Forces guys and a disaster that would have ended careers or way worse. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe to Stories of Sacrifice so you never miss these powerful true stories of courage and sacrifice. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Look, it started out like any other morning at Fort Bragg's training facility. You know, the kind of sticky, humid North Carolina day where your uniform's glued to your back before you even finish your first cup of coffee. Captain Chun rolled up at 0500, same as always, parking her beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic way out in the back corner where the medical vehicles usually sat. She was 38, maybe 5'4" on a good day, with jet black hair yanked back in a bun so tight it looked like it hurt. When she walked, she moved like she was trying not to take up too much space. People thought that meant she was timid. Man, were they wrong about that. She'd been assigned to this unit for 16 weeks, rotating through as part of the Army Nurse Corps to basically babysit these high-risk training ops from a medical standpoint. The operators, they pretty much pretended she didn't exist. She was support staff. She was medical. She was, and I'm quoting one particularly loudmouthed staff sergeant here, just there to check boxes and hand out Motrin like candy. Every single morning she'd set up her little aid station in the corner of the training bay, lay out her gear like she was organizing a toolbox, and just wait. The teams would maybe nod at her, grunt something that might have been a greeting, then proceed to beat the hell out of themselves while she watched from the sidelines. She never complained, never said a word when they cracked jokes about needing her to kiss their boo-boos better. She just stood there, hands clasped in front of her, eyes locked on everything happening on that training floor with this crazy intensity that nobody seemed to catch. So this particular Thursday morning, the training scenario was your standard building breach drill, a 3-story mock-up designed to look like the kind of urban combat zones these guys might see overseas. 17 operators from 2 different Special Forces A teams were running through a hostage rescue situation, complete with simunitions, flashbangs, the whole 9 yards, all on a clock that would make most people sweat bullets. The guy running the show was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Drummond, a dude with 22 years in Special Forces and enough ribbons on his chest to tell you he'd seen some serious action in some seriously bad places. Drummond was good at his job, real careful about safety, but he was also 100% convinced that medical people were basically necessary baggage. He'd made that crystal clear to Captain Chun on day 1. Stay out of the way, stay quiet, and if something goes sideways, you'll know it, he told her, not mean exactly, but with that tone people use when they've said the same thing to 100 medical folks before and don't expect this one to be any different. She just nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and then spent the next 16 weeks watching everything. Learning the patterns. Studying how these operators moved. Memorizing the facility layout, the equipment, the protocols, all the backup plans. Nobody asked her why she was watching so hard. Nobody seemed to give a damn. At 0730, the first team hit the kill house, moving like a well-oiled machine, the kind of coordination you only get from training together for years. Captain Chun was at her station, 70 meters away, binoculars in hand. The range safety officer, Master Sergeant Kowalski, stood nearby monitoring the radio chatter. Everything was going smooth. Real smooth. Too smooth, actually. That's when Chun saw it. This tiny thing, basically nothing, just this flicker of movement that didn't match the pattern she'd been watching for 4 months straight. One of the flashbang training devices, sitting there waiting for the second team's run, was positioned about 3 inches closer to a heating vent than it should have been. 16 weeks of watching. 16 weeks of seeing how these things got handled, stored, set up. She knew the protocols better than her own phone number by now. 3 inches. That's all it was. But 3 inches meant the heat from that vent could mess with the delay mechanism. Could turn a 7-second delay into a 3-second delay. Could turn a training device into something that'd blow up in somebody's hand. She opened her mouth to say something, then shut it. Who was she, right? Just a nurse. Just the medical person they tolerated because regs said they had to. Kowalski wouldn't listen. Drummond definitely wouldn't listen. She'd learned that lesson about 14 times over the past 4 months. Learned that when you're just anything in the military, people stop hearing your words before they even leave your mouth. So she watched. The second team was gearing up. 6 operators, every single one of them a weapons specialist with more combat deployments than she had years in service, or so they thought. The team leader, Staff Sergeant Martinez, was doing his final equipment check. 30 seconds till they entered the kill house. 20 seconds. She watched Martinez's hand move toward the flashbang. Watched him pick it up, watched his fingers wrap around it. She'd seen thousands of people handle thousands of devices, had watched these specific guys handle these specific devices hundreds of times. Something was off. Not with Martinez. with the device, the way it sat in his hand, this slight discoloration on the base that screamed heat exposure if you knew what to look for. Martinez moved toward the entry point, his whole team stacked up behind him. 15 seconds to breach. Captain Chun took 3 steps forward. "Sir," she said quietly to Kowalski. He didn't even turn around. "Sir," she said again, louder this time. "Not now, Captain," Kowalski shot back, eyes glued to the kill house. 10 seconds to breach. Every instinct in her body was going haywire. 8 seconds. She moved. Not toward Kowalski. Not toward Drummond. Straight toward the staging area where the second team was lined up. "Excuse me, Staff Sergeant Martinez," she said, and her voice had this edge to it that made people's heads turn. Martinez spun around, irritation all over his face. "Ma'am, we're about to breach. I need you to put that flashbang back on the table," she said. Not asking, telling. The entire training bay just froze. Lieutenant Colonel Drummond's voice cut through the space like a knife. "Captain Chun, return to your station. Now." She didn't budge. Didn't even look at Drummond. Kept her eyes locked on Martinez. "Staff Sergeant, that device has been exposed to heat from the staging vent. The delay mechanism's probably compromised. Put it on the table and step back." Martinez looked at Drummond, then back at Chun. That flashbang in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Drummond was walking toward them now, his face turning that particular shade of red that happens when someone questions your authority in front of 17 Special Forces operators and 3 junior officers. "Captain, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you are interfering with a live training exercise. Get back to your station immediately or I will have you removed from this facility." She turned to face him then, and something in her eyes made him stop mid-step. Not defiance exactly. Not fear. Something else. Something that looked a whole lot like absolute certainty. "Sir, with respect, that device is unsafe. It needs to be checked by end of day before anyone handles it again." "That device was inspected this morning by qualified personnel," Drummond said, his voice tight like he was barely holding it together. "You are a nurse, Captain. You are not qualified to make calls about explosive devices, training or otherwise. This is your final warning." The words just hung there in the air. Just a nurse. There it was. The thing that had been floating around her for 16 weeks finally said out loud in front of everybody. Martinez still had the flashbang in his hand. His team was watching. The first team had stopped their exercise, guys pressed up against the kill house windows trying to see what was going down. Kowalski had finally turned around, looking somewhere between confused and concerned. Captain Chun looked at the flashbang, then at Martinez, then at Drummond. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, and absolutely unmovable. "Sir, I am asking you, one officer to another, to get EOD to inspect that device before this exercise continues. And I am ordering you, one officer to another, to get back to your station and let us do our jobs." She didn't move. The silence stretched out. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then Martinez did something that surprised everyone, probably including himself. He put the flashbang back on the table. "Sir," he said to Drummond, "if Captain Chun thinks something's wrong, maybe we should check it out. 5-minute delay won't kill the training schedule." Drummond's face went from red to straight up purple. "Staff Sergeant, you are not making this call. Pick up that device and execute the mission." Martinez didn't move. Neither did his team. The other operators, the guys from the first team, were coming out of the kill house now, forming this loose half-circle around what was basically a showdown. Nobody was saying anything, but you could feel the weight of everyone watching. Here's what none of them knew. What Captain Chun had never mentioned because nobody had ever bothered to ask. Before she joined the Army Nurse Corps, before she spent 8 years working in military hospitals from Germany all the way to Afghanistan, before she became just a nurse, she'd spent 6 years as an explosive ordnance disposal tech. She'd graduated at the top of her class from the Naval School of Explosive Ordnance Disposal. She'd done 3 tours in Iraq during the surge, disarming IEDs in Ramadi and Fallujah, crawling through rubble and dust to make safe devices that had already killed dozens of soldiers. She'd gotten 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart for stuff she never talked about. She'd left EOD not because she couldn't hack it, but because after watching too many friends die from wounds that could have been survivable with better immediate medical care, she figured she could save more lives with a nursing degree than with a robot and a bomb suit. But she'd never stopped being an EOD tech, never stopped seeing the world through that lens of constant threat assessment and explosive physics, never stopped noticing things other people missed. She'd spotted the heat exposure on that flashbang from 70 meters away, recognized the subtle discoloration that meant propellant degradation, calculated the odds of premature detonation at about 60%. 60%. Better odds than she'd faced on a dozen IED calls in Ramadi. But here, in a training facility with 17 operators who thought she was just there to hand out band-aids, 60% was completely unacceptable. Drummond stepped closer to her, dropping his voice to where only she could hear. "Captain, I have been running training operations for 15 years. I have personally overseen thousands of exercises without incident. I do not need a nurse telling me how to do my job. You have 10 seconds to get back to your station or I will bring charges of insubordination and interference with military operations. Do you understand me?" She met his eyes. "Yes, sir. I understand you perfectly, and I'm still asking you to call EOD." "5 seconds, Captain." She didn't move. Drummond turned to Kowalski. "Master Sergeant, remove Captain Chun from this facility." Kowalski hesitated. He'd worked with Drummond for 3 years. Respected the guy, trusted his judgment. But there was something about the way Captain Chun was standing there, perfectly calm, perfectly still, that made him pause. Martinez spoke up. "Sir, we're talking about a 5-minute delay to check one device. We can adjust the schedule. It's not worth—" "I did not ask for your input, Staff Sergeant." Drummond snapped. Then back to Chin. "Last chance, Captain." She reached up, slow and deliberate, and unbuttoned the top pocket of her uniform. From inside, she pulled out this small leather wallet, worn at the edges, the kind of thing someone carries for years. She opened it and held it out, not to Drummond, but to Kowalski. Kowalski stepped forward, looked at what she was holding, and went completely still. It was an EOD badge. Not some replica. Not something you buy online. The real deal, gold and heavy, with her name engraved on the back along with a 6-digit ID number that could be verified in about 30 seconds. The Master Sergeant's eyes went from the badge to Chen's face, then back to the badge. When he spoke, his voice had changed completely. "Sir, Captain Chun is EOD qualified." Drummond frowned. "What?" "She's got an EOD badge, sir. Current credentials." Chun hadn't moved. The badge was still in her hand, catching the morning light coming through the training bay windows. "That doesn't mean anything," Drummond said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Lots of people have badges from old assignments. She's a nurse now." "Sir," Chun said quietly, "I maintained my EOD certification. I recertify every single year. I completed my last refresher course 11 months ago at Eglin Air Force Base. My credentials are current and valid, and that flashbang has been heat compromised. It's unsafe." All 17 operators were watching now. Martinez had taken a step back from the table where the flashbang sat. One of the team leaders, Captain Rodriguez, had his phone out, already pulling up the military credentials database. "What's your badge number?" Rodriguez asked. Chun rattled it off from memory. Rodriguez typed, waited. 30 seconds crawled by. Then he looked up, his face carefully neutral. "She's current, sir. Full EOD certification. Last refresher November last year. Top of her class." The training bay was dead silent. Drummond stared at Chun like she'd just appeared out of thin air. "You're EOD qualified." "Yes, sir." "You've been here for 4 months." "16 weeks, sir." "Yes." "And you never mentioned this?" She looked at him, and for the first time, something like emotion crossed her face. "Sir, with all due respect, I mentioned it 3 times. Once during my initial briefing with the facility commander, once in my introductory email to the training staff, and once in conversation with Master Sergeant Kowalski during week 2. Each time, I was told that I was here as medical personnel, that my EOD background wasn't relevant to my current assignment, and that I should focus on my nursing duties." The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. Kowalski had the decency to look uncomfortable. He remembered now. Sort of. Something about her background. He'd blown it off. She was a nurse. That's what she was there to do. Drummond's face had gone from purple to this ashy white. "You should have," he started, then stopped. Because what could he say? That she should have insisted harder? That she should have made them listen? She tried. She told them. They just hadn't cared. Martinez spoke into the silence. "Sir, should we call EOD?" Drummond looked at the flashbang on the table. Looked at Chun. Looked at the 17 operators who were all watching this play out like it was the most important thing they'd seen all year. Finally, he nodded. "Make the call." EOD showed up in 12 minutes flat. 2-person team with a portable X-ray unit and that easy confidence that comes from handling dangerous stuff every single day. The senior tech was Staff Sergeant Williams, who took one look at Captain Chen's badge and gave her this nod. The kind of nod that passes between people who've done the same hard job, even if they've never met. Williams checked out the flashbang with a handheld thermal scanner, took 3 X-ray shots from different angles, then carefully moved it to the controlled detonation area behind the training facility. 20 minutes later, the explosion rattled the windows of the training bay. Not the sharp crack of a properly working training device, but this deeper, faster boom that made everyone flinch. Williams came back alone, without the device, looking grim as hell. Heat exposure degraded the delay element, he said, talking to Drummond but looking at Chun. Delay was down to about 2 seconds, maybe less. If Staff Sergeant Martinez had pulled that pin during the breach, he didn't finish. Didn't need to. 2 seconds meant the device would have gone off in Martinez's hand. Would have taken his fingers, maybe his whole hand, maybe more depending on the angle. Would have peppered his whole team with shrapnel. Would have turned a training exercise into a mass casualty nightmare. Would have been the kind of incident that ends careers and fills hospital beds and makes national news for all the wrong reasons. 17 operators. 1 screwed up device. 2 seconds. Martinez was staring at his right hand like he'd never seen it before. The hand that had been holding that flashbang. The hand that would have still been holding it when it blew if Captain Chun hadn't stepped up. Drummond looked like someone had gut-punched him. When Williams left, taking his gear and his report that would work its way up the chain of command, the training bay stayed silent. Chun started heading back to her aid station, but Drummond's voice stopped her. "Captain." She turned. He looked at her for a long moment, and you could see the war happening behind his eyes. Pride versus reality, ego versus being professional, anger versus gratitude. Being professional won, but barely. "Thank you," he said. The words came out rough, like they'd been dragged over gravel, but they came out. "You're welcome, sir." She moved to walk away again, but Martinez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "You saved my hand. Probably more than that. Thank you doesn't really cut it, but thank you." She looked at him, this staff sergeant who'd been one of the loudest voices calling her just a nurse, and her expression softened. "You're welcome, Staff Sergeant. You made the right call when you put that device down. That took guts. Not as much as standing up to an O5 in front of the whole unit," one of the other operators said quietly. There was a murmur of agreement. Captain Chun had never wanted this moment, had never wanted the attention, the recognition, the big scene where everyone suddenly saw her differently. She'd spent 16 weeks being invisible because invisible was easier, because she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the people who need to prove themselves the least are the ones who've already proven themselves the most. But here she was, standing in the middle of a training bay with 17 Special Forces operators looking at her like they'd never really seen her before, and maybe they hadn't. "I'm gonna ask you something," Drummond said, his voice still rough but steadier now. "Why didn't you push harder? When you told us about your EOD background and we blew you off, why didn't you make us listen?" She thought about that for a second. "Sir, I've spent 13 years in the military, 8 as EOD, 5 as a nurse. I've learned that you can't make people listen. You can only be ready when they need you. And if we hadn't needed you today, if that device had been fine and you'd been wrong, then I would have been wrong, sir. I'd rather be wrong 100 times than right once and not speak up." One of the team leaders, Sergeant First Class Thompson, who'd been in Special Forces for 12 years, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've got a question. You've been watching us train for 16 weeks. What else have you noticed?" She hesitated. This was the moment where she could fade back into being just a nurse, could let this whole thing blow over and go back to comfortable invisibility. Or she could step all the way forward. She chose forward. "Your breaching technique leaves the number 2 man exposed for about half a second longer than optimal when crossing the threshold. 3rd week of training, Corporal Davidson showed signs of heat exhaustion 20 minutes before he reported it. Irregular breathing, less precision with weapon handling. Your pre-mission briefings spend about 40% of the time on stuff that has less than a 5% chance of happening, while spending less than 10% on medical evac procedures that have a 30% chance of being needed. And your aid station is 70 meters from the primary training area when combat casualty care guidelines say 40 meters max for optimal response time during golden hour incidents." The silence that followed was different. This wasn't shock. This was professionals recognizing another professional. Thompson looked at Rodriguez. Martinez was shaking his head slowly, not disagreeing, more like he couldn't believe it. 16 weeks. Thompson said. "You've been here 16 weeks, watching us, and nobody asked what you saw." "I'm just a nurse, Sergeant," Chun said, "but there was this tiny training area when combat casualty care guidelines say 40 meters max for optimal response time during golden hour incidents." The silence that followed was different. This wasn't shock. This was professionals recognizing another professional. Thompson looked at Rodriguez. Martinez was shaking his head slowly, not disagreeing, more like he couldn't believe it. 16 weeks. Thompson said. "You've been here 16 weeks, watching us, and nobody asked what you saw." "I'm just a nurse, Sergeant," Chun said, but there was this tiny hint of something in her voice. Not quite humor, not quite bitterness, somewhere in between. "No, ma'am," Martinez said firmly. "You're not." What happened next wasn't some Hollywood moment. No applause, no sudden group hug of respect and brotherhood. This was the military, where change happens in small steps and trust gets earned through actions, not words. But things shifted. Drummond called a 30-minute break, then quietly asked Captain Chun if she'd be willing to go over the training protocols with him. She said yes. They spent an hour going through procedures, talking about safety margins, figuring out where things could be better. He listened. Actually listened. Took notes, asked real questions. Later that afternoon, training started up again with a fresh batch of flashbangs that had been triple-checked, with Captain Chen's aid station moved to 45 meters from the training area, and with Martinez's team pulling off a successful breach using the technique tweaks she'd suggested. When the day wrapped at 1700 hours, Chun packed up her equipment with the same careful precision she'd shown for 16 weeks. But when she walked to her car, 3 of the operators were hanging by their vehicles, and Staff Sergeant Martinez called out to her. "Ma'am, some of us are grabbing food at the mess hall. You interested?" She paused, looked at them. These guys who'd spent 16 weeks looking past her, seeing only what they expected to see. "Sure, Staff Sergeant. I'll meet you there." At dinner, they asked her about Iraq, about EOD, about why she'd switched to nursing. She told them, and they listened with the kind of attention that soldiers give to stories that actually matter. She learned that Martinez had 2 kids, that Thompson was teaching himself Arabic in his spare time, that Rodriguez had been a high school teacher before he joined up. They weren't special forces operators in the mess hall. They were just people, same as her. "Can I ask you something?" Rodriguez said over terrible coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a diesel tank. "Why stay quiet for so long? You could have made us respect your background from day one." Chen thought about that. Respect isn't something you can make people give you. It's something you earn by being there when it matters. Today mattered. That's enough. "What if there'd been another incident before today?" Thompson asked. "What if something had gone down that your experience could have prevented?" "Then I would have stepped forward," she said simply. "Same as I did today. I was watching. I was ready. That's all I needed to be." Martinez leaned back in his chair. "You know what's crazy? We've been running these training cycles for years. Dozens of medical people have rotated through. Most of them, we barely remember their names. But I'm gonna remember you for the rest of my career." "Why is that?" "Because you saved my hand and you didn't want credit for it. That's a whole different kind of courage." The report of what went down made its way up the chain of command with the speed of bad news in a military bureaucracy. By Monday morning, Captain Chun got called to a meeting with the facility commander, a full colonel named Patterson who'd spent 25 years in special operations. She stood at attention in his office, expecting to get chewed out for the confrontation with Drummond, for disrupting training, for making waves. Instead, Patterson pointed to a chair. "Sit down, Captain." She sat. Patterson studied her for a long moment. "I've read the report. I've talked to Lieutenant Colonel Drummond. I've talked to Staff Sergeant Martinez. And I've gone through your personnel file, which I should have looked at more carefully 4 months ago." He paused. "You've got an interesting career path. EOD Tech with an exceptional service record. Bronze Stars. Purple Heart. Then you left EOD for nursing. That's not exactly common." "No, sir. It's not." "Why'd you do it?" She'd answered this question before, but never for someone who seemed genuinely interested in the answer. "Sir, in Ramadi in 2009, I responded to an IED incident where 3 soldiers got wounded. I made the secondary device safe, but by the time we got the casualties to the aid station, one of them had bled out. Femoral artery. He was alive when we loaded him in the vehicle, alive when we started driving, but we didn't have anyone with real trauma training on scene, and the medic was overwhelmed with 2 other critical patients. That soldier died from a wound that was survivable. I decided that day that I wanted to be the person who could keep people alive long enough to get them to definitive care." Patterson nodded slowly. "So you spent 2 years getting your nursing degree, got commissioned as a nurse corps officer, and spent the next 5 years saving lives in military hospitals." "Yes, sir." "But you kept your EOD certification current." "Yes, sir. Because bombs don't stop being bombs just because I'm not actively defusing them anymore. And combat veterans don't stop running into explosive hazards just because I changed my job. I wanted to be ready for whatever came up, like a compromised training device in a facility where nobody expected you to know jack about explosives." "Yes, sir." Patterson leaned forward. "Captain, I'm gonna be straight with you. Lieutenant Colonel Drummond is a good officer. He runs a solid training program. But he screwed up with you. We all did. We saw a nurse on your assignment orders and we stopped looking. We put you in a box and left you there. That's on us, not on you." "Sir, I didn't need—" "Yes, you did," Patterson interrupted gently. "You did need recognition. You did need us to know who you were and what you brought to the table. Not for your ego. Not for your career. But because when we dismiss someone's expertise, we create blind spots. And blind spots get people killed. The silence in the office was heavy. Chen didn't trust herself to speak. I'm reassigning you, Patterson continued. Not as punishment, as an upgrade. I want you working directly with our training staff, developing medical protocols for high-risk exercises. I also want you consulting on all explosive and ordnance-related training activities. You'll still provide medical support, but you'll be doing it from a position where people actually listen to you. Sir, I don't need special treatment. I can. Captain, this isn't special treatment. This is me doing my job right for the first time since you got here. You're the most qualified person in this facility for this work. The fact that it took a near disaster for us to figure that out is something I'm gonna have to live with. Don't make me feel worse by arguing about it. She nodded. Yes, sir. Good. Get with Master Sergeant Kowalski tomorrow morning. He'll brief you on the new responsibilities. Dismissed. She stood, saluted, turned to leave. At the door, Patterson's voice stopped her. Captain, one more thing. She turned back. That soldier in Ramadi, the one you couldn't save. What was his name? She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. Specialist Andrew Chun, sir. He was my brother. Patterson's face showed nothing, but his eyes showed understanding. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, sir. I've tried to make it count. I'd say you've succeeded. She left the office with her eyes dry and her spine straight, the way her brother had taught her to carry herself, the way EOD had reinforced, the way 13 years of service had made permanent. That evening, back in her tiny apartment off base, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about the path that had brought her here. About Andrew, who'd been killed by wounds she couldn't treat fast enough, about the hundreds of IEDs she'd disabled, the dozens of lives she'd saved directly, the thousands she'd saved indirectly by taking out threats before they could kill, about the switch to nursing, the years in hospitals, the satisfaction of closing wounds instead of just preventing them, about 16 weeks of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being called just a nurse by people who couldn't see past their own assumptions, about the moment when she'd stepped forward, knowing it might cost her reputation, her position, maybe even her career, because 17 lives were worth more than her comfort, and about Martinez's hand, whole and working, able to hold his kids, able to keep doing his job, able to stay intact because she'd been willing to be uncomfortable for 5 minutes. Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. She opened it. Ma'am, this is SSG Martinez. Got your number from the unit roster. Hope that's cool. Just wanted to say again that what you did today meant everything. My daughter's 3rd birthday is next week, and I get to be there to pick her up and throw her in the air because you spoke up when nobody wanted to listen. I'm not great with words, but thank you. Really. She read it twice, then typed back. You're welcome, Staff Sergeant. Give your daughter a hug from me. And for what it's worth, you made the right call when it mattered. That takes real courage. CPT Chin. She sent it, set the phone down, went back to her tea. The next 6 months changed everything and nothing all at once. Captain Chen's new gig meant she was in every planning meeting, every safety briefing, every after-action review. Her suggestions got implemented. Her protocols got adopted. The training accident rate dropped by 37%. Martinez's team passed their final eval with the highest marks in the cycle. Drummond asked her to help with a safety manual he was writing for special operations training facilities across the military. She gave him 14 pages of detailed recommendations. He used 13 of them and sent her a thank you note. The operators stopped calling her just a nurse, started calling her Doc instead. Same thing they called the corpsmen and medics who'd earned their respect downrange. She corrected them the first few times. She was an officer, they should use her rank, but eventually she stopped. Doc meant something. It meant they saw her as part of the team. The funny thing was, what she actually did hadn't changed. She still set up her aid station every morning, still laid out her equipment like she was organizing a toolbox, still watched the training exercises with that same unwavering attention. She was still a nurse. She'd never stopped being a nurse, but now people got that nurse wasn't a limitation. It was just a description of one skill set among many. It didn't define her any more than EOD Tech had, any more than sister or veteran or person who refused to stay quiet when lives were on the line defined her. She was all of those things. She contained multitudes, you know? In November, she got invited to speak at an Army Nurse Corps conference about integrating specialized military experience into nursing practice. She almost said no. Public speaking had never been her thing, but she thought about all the other medical folks who might have similar backgrounds, similar expertise, similar stories of being overlooked and underused. She said yes. Her speech was straightforward. No dramatic stuff, just the facts of what happened, the lessons learned, the recommendations for how the military could do better at recognizing and using the full range of skills that service members brought to their jobs. At the end, during the Q&A, a young lieutenant raised her hand. "Ma'am, what would you say to someone who feels like they're being put in a box? Someone whose skills and experience aren't being recognized?" Chen thought about that carefully. "I'd say you can't control what other people see when they look at you. You can't make them recognize your value. All you can do is be excellent at what you do, pay attention to what's happening around you, and be ready to step forward when the moment requires it. Don't step forward for recognition. Step forward because lives matter more than comfort. Do that, and eventually the right people will notice. The wrong people might not, but that's their problem, not yours." In December, her rotation at Fort Bragg ended. She got orders to a military hospital in Germany. On her last day, the training staff threw her a small going-away thing in the break room. There was terrible coffee and a sheet cake from the commissary that someone had decorated with frosting that looked like it had been applied by someone with the shakes. Drummond made a short speech about lessons learned and excellence in service. Kowalski gave her a plaque with her name engraved on it, along with the dates of her assignment and the words, "Never just anything." Martinez and his team gave her a unit coin, their personal coins, not the official ones, each one signed on the back with a message. Martinez's said, "For the hand I still have." Thompson said, "For making us see what we were missing." Rodriguez's said, "For teaching us that courage comes in many forms." 17 coins total. She took them with steady hands and dry eyes, because that's what 13 years of service had taught her to do in public. Save the tears for private. Save the emotion for when it can't mess with the mission. Save the vulnerability for the moments when you're alone and you can afford to feel everything you've been holding back. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's been an honor to serve with you guys." That night, in her apartment surrounded by boxes, she held Martinez's coin and thought about the path of one flashbang that had never gone off in his hand. Thought about the 17 operators who'd kept training, who'd deployed overseas, who'd done their missions and come home. Thought about the kids who still had dads, the spouses who still had partners, the families that stayed intact. Thought about the ripple effect of one moment of courage, hers, yeah, but also Martinez's when he'd put the device down, Drummond's when he'd admitted he was wrong, Patterson's when he'd fixed the situation. Courage was contagious. So was respect. So was the willingness to see people for who they really were instead of who you assumed them to be. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Martinez. "Ma'am, my daughter's asking when Captain Chun is coming back to throw her in the air again. Told her you're headed to Germany, but you'll always be part of our family. Safe travels. You changed everything here." She read it, and this time, in the privacy of her apartment with nobody watching, she let herself smile. Changed everything. Maybe, or maybe she'd just been herself, fully and completely, at the moment when being herself mattered most. Maybe that's all any of them could really do. Be ready, be observant, be willing to step forward when the moment demanded it. Be willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of someone else's safety. Be willing to be underestimated if it meant being present when it counted. She packed the coins carefully in her carry-on, the bag that would stay with her on the flight, and thought about Andrew, about how he'd always believed she could do anything she set her mind to, how he'd pushed her to join EOD even when everyone else said she was too small, too young, too female, about how his death had redirected her entire life, had transformed her from someone who dealt with threats to someone who healed wounds, about how both paths had led her to that moment in the training bay when she'd known, absolutely known, that speaking up was the right thing to do no matter what it cost. "I hope you'd be proud," she said quietly to the empty apartment, to the memory of her brother, to the version of herself that had knelt beside him in Ramadi trying desperately to keep him alive. "I hope you know I'm still trying to make it count." The next morning, she drove off Fort Bragg for the last time, past the gate guard who saluted her, past the training facilities where 17 operators were running through another exercise with new safety protocols and better medical positioning, past the place where she'd spent 16 weeks being invisible and one day being completely seen. She didn't look back. Forward was the only direction that mattered. In Germany, she'd work in a Level 1 trauma center, treating combat casualties and training the next generation of military medical personnel. She'd keep recertifying her EOD credentials every year, just in case. She'd carry those 17 coins wherever she went, a reminder that courage and recognition were things you earned through action, not words. And she'd tell her story when it mattered, to people who needed to hear it, to young nurses and medics and techs who felt invisible in their roles, who carried hidden expertise that nobody thought to ask about. She'd tell them what she'd learned. That being underestimated wasn't always a disadvantage. That quiet competence spoke louder than loud credentials. That the moment you stepped forward might cost you comfort, but it could save lives, and that trade was always worth making. That just a nurse, or just a medic, or just anything, was a phrase used by people who didn't understand that there was no such thing as just when it came to service members who showed up every day to do hard work with excellence and integrity. That watching and learning and being ready mattered more than demanding recognition. That you couldn't control how people saw you, but you could control what you did when it counted. 3 years down the road, Staff Sergeant Martinez would get promoted to Sergeant First Class and would tell the story of the nurse who saved his hand to every new team that rotated through Fort Bragg's training facility. He wouldn't embellish anything. The facts needed no embellishment. Lieutenant Colonel Drummond would retire and spend his retirement teaching at a military college, where he'd use the incident as a case study about the importance of recognizing expertise no matter what someone's job title said and the dangers of making assumptions. He'd always end the lecture by saying, "The best officer I ever dismissed was a nurse. I learned more from that mistake than from any success in my career." Captain Rodriguez would eventually make Major and would roll out similar safety protocols at training facilities across Special Operations Command, saving an estimated 47 lives over the next decade by catching hazards that might have otherwise been missed. Master Sergeant Kowalski would never forget the lesson of those 16 weeks and would make it his personal mission to actually read the backgrounds of every single person assigned to his units, to ask about their expertise, to listen when they spoke. He'd find 3 more people with unexpected credentials over his remaining years of service, and he'd make sure their expertise got used from day one. Colonel Patterson would get promoted to Brigadier General and would write new guidance for the entire Special Operations community about talent management and the importance of looking beyond job titles to see the complete person. The guidance would become standard practice across the military, and Captain Sarah Chun would keep serving for another 12 years, rising to Lieutenant Colonel, treating thousands of patients, training hundreds of medical personnel, and preventing dozens of preventable deaths through her combination of medical expertise and explosive ordnance knowledge. She'd never seek recognition for any of it. She'd simply show up, do the work, watch carefully, and step forward when the moment required it. She'd retire with a chest full of decorations and a career full of lives saved, and would never once call herself a hero. When people asked her about the incident at Fort Bragg, about the flashbang that never went off, about the day she stopped being just a nurse, she'd tell them the truth. "I was always more than just a nurse. So was everyone else I served with. We were all just people trying to do hard jobs with honor. Sometimes that meant defusing bombs. Sometimes that meant treating wounds. Sometimes that meant speaking up when nobody wanted to listen. The job changed, but the commitment never did. And she never talked about it in dramatic terms again. She didn't need to." The 17 operators who kept their careers going with all their fingers intact, the hundreds of service members who benefited from the improved safety protocols, the thousands of soldiers who got better medical care because of the positioning changes she recommended, the countless young military folks who heard her story and learned to step forward when it mattered. They spoke for her.